In this review, we will once more venture into the world of Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars Trilogy via the short story collection The Martians. It is important to stress that it is plural, so do not mix it up with Andy Weir's quite popular and successful novel The Martian, which also resulted in an entertaining movie with the same name. But enough about Andy Weir's work. The Martians was published in 1999 and is roughly 340 pages long. It is listed on Goodreads as the 3.5th entry to the Mars Trilogy, using a numbering system that is often applied for short stories in other book series. The Expanse would come to mind. However, in this case, this numbering scheme does not really work. The Martians contains 31 chapters. Some of them take place during a time when the RS-2 mission is being prepared on Earth or still on its way to Mars, thus placing it in the timeline before the first events of Red Mars. Other stories take place during or possibly even after the main storyline. To add further confusion, some stories originate from deviating timelines, thus introducing parallel universes to the story of the Mars Trilogy. Nonetheless, one thing is for sure. Anyone who is interested in reading The Martians should know that it only makes sense once you have finished the Mars Trilogy. With this, you have been issued a general spoiler warning for Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars. So beware. It is best to take a closer look at the table of contents of The Martians to organize the different timelines and untangle everything a bit. At first, we have chapters that take place in the main storyline of the trilogy. Looking at the highlighted titles, you can see that some chapters flesh out the story of Desmond, the stowaway on the RS-2. Another chapter expands the story of Zoe, the point-of-view character with one of the smallest page counts in the entire trilogy. Ironically, this is done through the lens of her mother Jackie. Thus, Zoe's overall page count, including the Martians, does not increase. The rest of the main storyline chapters can be seen as supplementary material, such as the constitution of Mars. In total, about 15% of the Martians seem to take place in the main storyline of the trilogy. One diverging timeline consisting of 2 chapters tells the story of psychologist Michelle evaluating the prospective participants of the RS-2 mission in Antarctica. This introduces an entire parallel storyline where there is a decreased effort by Earth to settle and colonize Mars compared to the main storyline. Mostly, research and exploration are the drivers to establish stations on the Red Planet. Overall, about 1/10 of The Martians takes place in this parallel universe. The second diverging storyline, usually called the Eileen Monday and Roger Claiborne continuity, because it tends to focus on these 2 new characters, tells the story of the colonization of Mars if the revolt at the end of Red Mars did not happen. The exact differences to the main storyline are not explicitly mentioned, and some of the chapters seem to blur the line between the diverging and the main storyline. Most notably, the pace of terraformation seems to be slower than in the trilogy, and a global cooling sets in the 23rd century. Furthermore, the society in this divergent story appears to have suffered fewer or even none of the violent and traumatic events that did occur in the main story, leading to a more peaceful atmosphere between the inhabitants of the Martian colonies and their Terran counterparts. Overall, the Eileen Monday and Roger Claiborne continuity takes up about half of the page count of The Martians. The lion's share of this story arc is covered in the chapter Green Mars, the novella that Kim Stanley Robinson published in Asimov Science Fiction in 1985 and thus preceded the publication of the Mars Trilogy by several years, not the novel Green Mars, which is part of the trilogy itself. The remaining chapters cannot be linked to one of the previously mentioned storylines and consist of short stories, Martian folklore, poems, or supplementary information related to the creation of the Mars Trilogy itself. In terms of critical reception, The Martians was awarded the Locus Award for Best Collection in 2000. It scores 3.58 and 3.35 stars on Goodreads and Library Thing, and on Amazon it received 4.1 stars, based on 140 ratings. Thus, it noticeably scores lower than the 3 books of the trilogy, which is not that surprising as it is less coherent in its storytelling. Also, some of the chapters are hit and miss in terms of overall quality, at least in my view. For instance, the poems specifically did not do it for me. It is hard to apply the semi-objective list of metrics related to the sci-fi hardness, scope of the world, originality, and list of characters that I usually use for full novels to this story collection in isolation, since it heavily relies on the Mars Trilogy. The Martians just does not work as a standalone novel, maybe with the exception of the novella Green Mars, but even that would be an edge case. Nevertheless, the short stories in this collection are imbued with similar values in these 4 categories as the 3 books of the trilogy. The stories are on the harder side of the sci-fi Mohs scale. The world building and scope of the world is again quite detailed, and it gives you chapters that focus also on places beyond Mars. The roster of characters relies heavily on the trilogy, although there are some new additions. On the one hand, some of the veteran characters are explored in more detail. On the other hand, the new characters that were introduced are interesting enough for the format of short stories, that is. Overall, the character and plot-driven chapters are for the most part interesting. Yet, they are not as captivating as the trilogy itself, owing to the lack of an overarching story and escalation of events. The supplementary chapters are more inconsistent in terms of quality and can feel like filler material. Thus, The Martians will mostly be interesting for readers that really enjoyed the Mars Trilogy and want to spend further time in this universe, or parallel versions of it.